India under British rule. I don't know if we're going to be able to really do both the Industrial Revolution and India under British rule, but I think we'll certainly get to the latter half of to some portion of the history of India under British rule very briefly, and I'll explain again when we get to that why I picked that particular segment. But remember that when we were talking about the Haitian Revolution, I mean, these are all things that I've really spoken to you about, except for one item here, which I'm going to mention very briefly. But as I pointed out to you, that the Haitian Revolution establishes the first free black republic in the world. It tests the limits of the French Revolution and the American Declaration of Independence, and gives rise to, in fact, the conception of universal rights. Of course, this would be disputed by those who would say that it was actually the French Revolution that did that, and I'm not interested in establishing a hierarchy of revolutions. But I think that from the little that you heard from me and the readings that we've done, by now you should certainly have a sense of how it is that the Haitian Revolution in some ways extended the conception of universal rights, which were never, of course, universal at all. And that's one reason why colonialism is such a potent force that we need to think about in the 19th century, moving into the 20th century. And recall this whole conception of the unthinkable, namely that the notion, the twin notions, number one, that black people could actually aspire to freedom, that they could, if I may use that cliche phrase, be agents, take charge of their own destiny. This itself was something that was really incomprehensible to even enlightened Europeans. And as I pointed out to you, the Enlightenment figures really could not conceive of something as radical and revolutionary as what transpired in Haiti. So therefore it becomes, in a sense, the unthinkable. The idea of racism, which is still very much present today, rears its ugly head, of course, and as we're going to see when we move on, because racism, again, is one of those themes that simply persist, it lingers on, and we're going to, unfortunately, witness its ugly smell, as it were, throughout the 19th century as well, right? It gives rise to other slave rebellions, something I pointed out very, very briefly in the concluding remarks that I'd offered to you on Monday. And as I pointed out to you, the question of reparations is there from the outset. In fact, Haiti did not really deal with its obligations, as France put it, until 1947, so 150 years after the Haitian Revolution. And something I did not really remark upon, and that's the point that I said is new here, and that is that the Haitian Revolution contributes to what is going to become the end of the global slave trade. I want to, however, make sure that you understand that there is a distinction between slavery and the global slave trade. The two are not exactly the same. The trading of slaves very well might have terminated, but the institution of slavery did not. In the American South, as we know, the institution of slavery persisted until the end of the Civil War, or the beginning of the Civil War, I mean, and the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's just that countries could no longer dispatch slaves, right, from one country to another. And this is going, and in France and in French possessions, so remember that the National Convention in the French Revolution in 1793 outlawed slavery, and then Napoleon, when he comes into power, is actually going to restore it. And then it's going to be subsequently banned again in France and French possessions. But it will not be banned by the British and in British possessions until the 1830s. Now, there are a number of other countries, such as Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, and the US. So in British possessions, it still continued in the British Caribbean. And it is really going to be in the 1830s that the slave trade will completely come to an end. But the Haitian Revolution played its part in bringing the slave trade to an end. All right? So when I say ends the global slave trade, I mean not literally in that sense, but that it helped to advance the end of the global slave trade. Now, this brings me to the next big segment, and that's the Industrial Revolution. But before we begin with the Industrial Revolution, I want you to really ponder look carefully at this chart and the following one, because really what it tells you is an extraordinary story, right? And that is, so this is a map with a chart which shows GDP, okay, and it begins in the year 1, but then, you know, 1000. So if you notice the key here, so this is the United States, of course, didn't exist at this point in time, which is why it doesn't contribute anything to the world's GDP, and then 1700, and then slowly you can see the rise from 1700 to 1950, what portion of the world's GDP is contributed by the US, and then you can see a decline here, but still over 20% in 2003 when this chart was drawn. What is most interesting for our purposes is to see what happens to China and India, right? To China and India. So if you take this point here, 1700, circa 1700 here, right? This is the point where you can see there's the greatest intersection. And if you look at it carefully, you can see that Western Europe accounted for something in the neighborhood of about 22% of the world's GDP. And then if you look at China, this is China here. China accounted for about the same, and India accounted for about 25%. In the year 1700, India accounted for 25% of the world's GDP. In the year 1900, it accounted for less than 2% of the world's GDP. All right? And you can see the same thing roughly with China as well. You're going to see a precipitous decline here in China, and then of course you know now that in the last 4 decades you see the increase over here. There's a Cambridge economist. Some of his, not everyone accepts these figures. One should say that at the outset, because all such claims, academic claims, are obviously disputed. But by and large, I think that the arguments advanced by Angus Madisson as a Cambridge economist, who did this massive study, a long-term study, and the results of this are to be found in a book called The World Economy, quoted in a number of other texts as well. So here you have it in terms of a table. So if you look at Britain, for example, Britain 1600, now you can see why this is all a precursor to our understanding of the Industrial Revolution, because the first country that industrialized was Great Britain. And in 1600, Britain accounted for 1.8%, 1700, 2.88, 1870, it accounts for 9.1% of the world's GDP. Britain is, of course, a very small country, right? And even if you include the entire United Kingdom, which would be England, Northern Ireland today, Scotland, and Wales. Even then, you're really talking about a very small population, certainly relative to India and China. And then you can see Western Europe. So this is where you can see, so 1600, 20%, 29% China, India 23%, and the year 1700, India is a little bit ahead over here, but they're roughly about the same. What we're saying is that 3 players really dominated the world economy: India, China, and all of Western Europe put together, right? And the narrative that you're going to have to think about is not only the advance of England, you're going to have to think about the immiseration, that is the complete poverty into which India is going to slide into, right? And of course, it's not an accident that's going to take place. It's going to be congruent with the rise of British rule in India, right? And again, necessary to add that there will be historians who will obviously contest this particular narrative, right? But it seems to me that the bulk of the evidence there is really fundamentally very strong. And there's another way in which one can really speak about the set of questions. So there's a phrase that is used very often in the literature today. It's called the Great Divergence. The Great Divergence. And I want to explain very briefly what that really means. So there's a book that has been written recently by Joel Mokyr. This book is just published, in fact, a couple of months ago. It's called The Culture of Growth, The Origins of the Modern Economy, so 2017. And this is the question that he poses repeatedly in the book. Why? And he's echoing here, by the way, a very famous historian of science in China, a massive work by Joseph Needham, also a Cambridge scholar. Why did China not have an industrial revolution? Right? It had everything going for one. A high level of literacy, a land of books, hardly any censorship, a sound schooling system, and above all, a meritocracy which had a long tradition of selecting its public servants through anonymous public examinations. Right? So what is it that led China down? Now, he doesn't really offer an explanation, in my view, of this great divergence. So what is a great divergence? Great divergence is that if you look at this, or the preceding slide over here, right, the preceding slide, why, if this, at this particular juncture, the three, Western Europe, India, and China, are all roughly at the same point, roughly, why is it that now they're going to start to diverge? Europe, Britain, Western Europe is going to have an industrial revolution. China and India are going to go into a decline. Why this sharp divergence? Right? So that's the fundamental question that many people have really been working on today. And you know that there's another narrative, which I'm not going to really take up right now in lecture 30, as it were, the last lecture. I'm going to just briefly allude to it, and that is, of course, that there's one narrative now about these two, large Asian, slumbering Asian giants that have woken up. China more so than India, according to this particular narrative. And there are intricate questions. Those intricate questions have to do, if you're looking at the latter-day narrative about the rise of China, and why is it that India hasn't actually shown that much growth in comparison to China? What is the relationship between growth and authoritarian systems, for example? Right? Is it possible to argue, and I think it is possible to argue that, so I'm just giving you a little glimmer of something that I'm going to be developing in week 10, particularly when we look at the whole ideology of development. Is it possible to argue that, in fact, if you look at the principal Asian economies that have done well in the last several decades, these have been largely authoritarian states. Singapore would be a classic example of another authoritarian state in many ways, and of course China as well. All right, which is far from saying that Indian democracy is perfect, not even remotely so, but there may be a greater degree of freedom in India, and that can actually pose problems for economic development in various ways. So, but these are questions I want you to start thinking about at this juncture, not just when we get to week 10. All right, and I want to raise one more consideration for you here at this juncture, which I'm not going to be able to really address, but I'll get back to it again in week 10, when we look very briefly at something I had not done in the first time I taught this class. This is the second time teaching, and which is to look at climate change. Because I think that it is impossible to really do work in the humanities and social sciences today and not be thinking about climate change. Yes, I know that Mr. Trump has appointed to the EPA a man who actually doesn't believe that there's something called climate change, and that the vast bulk of this present administration doesn't believe in it. But I think that these people are outliers, because I think the vast bulk of the evidence strongly supports this idea. But what is it that I want you to think about? All right? And this is almost a kind of a perverse argument, as you'll see in a way, but I want you to think about it. Look at this particular proposition, that the first several decades of the Industrial Revolution, so let's say 1750, 1760, and after, to about 1800, 1810, let's say the first 50 years of the Industrial Revolution, I want to say, led to a greater accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than the preceding tens of thousands of years put together. All right? And following on that, in the last 2 decades, we have seen a greater accumulation of greenhouse gases than we have in the 150, 180, 200 years after the Industrial Revolution. Okay? So now here's the perversity of the argument. Although it's a very plausible argument, and I don't think anyone really has given much thought to it. Had India not been colonized, had China also not declined, had both of these countries in fact seen the kind of industrial growth in the late 18th century, throughout the 19th century, the first half of the 20th century, that you're now seeing. Had these countries seen it, is it possible to argue that the problems of climate change would have been upon us 150 years ago? Not now. You see what I'm saying, right? I mean, this is not an argument for saying that colonialism is good. This is what I mean by the perversity of the argument in a way. I'm not even remotely trying to suggest that one can defend colonialism. But in an odd way, it is possible that because colonialism led to the deindustrialization, and I'll take up this thesis later on, to the deindustrialization of a country such as India. Right? Don't forget this, right? Don't forget where India is right here in 1700, accounting for 25% of the world's GDP, right? And then 150 years later, it's accounting for less than 2% of the world's GDP. What that means, a certain kind of deindustrialization that took place in India. And if this happened, is it possible to argue that in effect we were actually saved from the ravages of climate change for at least a period of time? Now, and Mohandas Gandhi, otherwise known as Mahatma Gandhi, put it very well. Because this is, when we think about the Industrial Revolution, we're not just studying a historical episode or set of events. We are trying to think through the implications of this for us today. So what did he say in 1930? What he argued was that if a small island nation such as England had to put up its flag, dominate 25% of the world, so that it could give its millions, tens of millions, a few tens of millions only, all right? It's 20 million or 30 million people, a standard of living which exceeded anything that anyone else had at that point in time. If it had to exploit such a large portion of the world, imagine how much of the world India and China would have to exploit. Imagine what extent of natural resources they would have to deplete in order to give all of their people that same standard of living. And that question still persists. Because you've got 1.3 billion people in India, slightly more in China, right? I mean, if you're talking about 2.5, 3 billion people, you want to give all of those people the same standard of living that all of us enjoy here, what's going to be left? You're going to have to strip the world bare, like locusts. Right? That is really the argument that you have to think about when we are talking about the Industrial Revolution. All right, so what was the Industrial Revolution? And of course, I'm starting it at this juncture because unlike the French Revolution, where we say, yeah, okay, this is what happened in 1789 and in the few years after that, the Industrial Revolution, of course, spans a period of time, a very long and considerable period of time. Look at this here. This is 1850, right? So, we're really now, we're talking about a century from 1750s, 1760s. 1760 is the point that was chosen by Arnold Toynbee. By the way, not the famous Arnold Toynbee, the historian, but actually an uncle of him by the same name. Right? So he identified 1760 as the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, that itself has been disputed. For example, there's another economic historian at Cambridge University, John Neff, who basically argued in the 1930s that the iron industry had been around since at least the 16th century, and we should say that the Industrial Revolution began around that time. So, you know, when I say 1750, 1760, even this is in fact a contested date. But again, we're looking at the bulk of the evidence. We're saying the bulk of the scholarly consensus is that, yes, we could say that the Industrial Revolution began somewhere around the middle part of the 18th century. All right, 1750, 1760, 1770, thereabouts. And if you look at this map over here, industrialization in Europe, 1850, what do you see? Because what are the ways in which one would measure whether a country has gone through an industrial revolution at that juncture? What kind of railways transportation system did it have? If you look at Great Britain here, the United Kingdom, you can see these red lines here, you can see the key here, completed railroads. This doesn't show railroads that are still, you know, the tracks where tracks are being laid down, where architects and civil engineers are still figuring out how to map the rest of the country in order to be able to put in railway tracks. These are completed railroads. You can see that Great Britain was much better connected than any portion of Europe, right? Including Western Europe. You know that Germany, of course, at this point was not unified. Italy was not unified. But Netherlands, which, if you remember your European history, had been a major power, you know, 2 centuries ago, right? You can see that there is a railway network. Most of France does not have railroads except in the northern portion, in and around Paris, for a little portion over here. And then if you look at the key over here, industrial areas. So the green, the shading in green is not very nicely done here, but you can see a large chunk of England over here, which is an industrial area over here. And then you see emerging industrial areas over here in the Ruhr, which is going to be, of course, important in World War II as well, because the German military machinery relied upon the industrial strength of this area, portions around here. What this map shows you very clearly is that when we speak about the Industrial Revolution, we're really not speaking about, a time span of 2 or 3 or 4 years. We're not speaking about an event as such. We're speaking about a process, right, over a period of decades. So what was the Industrial Revolution? Simplest definition, 3 words: the transformation of technology. If you wanted to put it that way. Now, we're going to see that this is an impoverished definition, but if you look up a dictionary definition, right, that would be the simplest definition that you would get, that it entailed the transformation of technology, and we have to distinguish it from capitalism. Of course, the two are congruent to some degree, but the two are not the same, because capitalism always also, of course, refers to a market economy, and more specifically, it refers to the fact that market forces set money prices that determine how goods are distributed, right? So this shift to industrial capitalism, right, was what? It was essentially a transition from a trade-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy. So what Industrial Revolution led to was a transformation through technology of manufacturing processes. Of manufacturing processes. Right? This is one element of it. There are other elements which we will turn to very shortly. But let us just try to put it in a larger context first, which is that I think that if we look at human history, we know that humans have always used tools to foster and organize production. Right? The Industrial Revolution was certainly one of the first steps in the long process of introducing mechanical power, and that's eventually what's going to lead to such things as the steam engine, railroads, steamships, all of that, right? The spinning jenny, so forth and so on, of introducing mechanical power alongside human and animal muscles to drive machines, right? And so what's going to happen in Britain and then eventually in Germany and in the United States is how technology is going to alter these modes of production. But I want to submit to you, and we will get to that in just a few minutes, that the Industrial Revolution was much more than a question of merely radically improved technologies, right? So, and that's at the base level. I think that this is what we have to see. What it also does is it ushers in unprecedented transformation in social organization, right? In social organization, and of course, eventually in military and economic power. Right? And to reiterate a point I made much earlier in my previous lecture, or perhaps in the lecture before that, the people who were living in the midst of this revolution, which retrospectively we began to call a revolution, did not always understand what actually was transpiring in their lives at that point. They certainly were not necessarily thinking that they were living through a revolution, let alone the working class. Even intellectuals in Britain were, I think, not quite certain about that. So what is it that moved Britain and Western Europe towards the Industrial Revolution? Let me just give you a list of things. We won't be able to discuss each of them at length, right? But just for you to ponder about. The emergence from agriculture as a principal basis of the economy, right? That one way to understand the Industrial Revolution, which entailed, by the way, a revolution in agriculture too, but its long-term implications are a movement away from agriculture as a principal basis of economy, right, to manufacturing. Quick question. This is the sort of thing I could have used poll everywhere for, but this will be a little faster. Right? What percentage of the population of the United States is occupied in agriculture today, you think? 2%. Yes. A little bit less than that, 1.5%. And what percentage of the American population was occupied in agriculture circa 1890? Yes. About how much? 60 to 80. A bit on the high side, closer to 50, but still very high. Right? Still very high. Right? Now, and I think that this is the change that we're really speaking about. Right? And so this is, when we speak about the Industrial Revolution, you know, one of the first implications we have to think about is a transition to an economy where agriculture is no longer the principal basis of that. Right? But again, you know, there are different ways to manipulate these figures, because here we're really speaking only about the percentage of people who are, strictly speaking, employed in agriculture. But then again, if you look at related industries such as the transportation of food, the canning of food, so forth and so on, then obviously the numbers will increase. But these are not people who are employed in agriculture; they're employed in manufacturing. You know, okay. All right. Increased concern with trade, commerce, and exploration. Right. What are the things that tended Britain and Western Europe towards the Industrial Revolution? Increased family demand for products for the household and for the dining table. Commitment to financial success. The pursuit of profit. The rise of the middle class. I want you to underscore that, the rise of the middle class. Right? What is a middle class? And you know that the conception of middle class is very elastic. Very elastic. You know, when I turn to India today, I have seen figures, when people try to figure out what percentage of India's population, or what numbers, let's forget about the percentage, what out of 1.3 billion people, 1.25 billion people, what numbers can we summon when we're speaking about the Indian middle class? I see figures anywhere from 150 million to 350 million. Now, you know, if you said it was 2 or 3 million here or there, this is a massive range. Partly because there is a problem in defining what exactly constitutes a middle class. So I want you to underscore that, because we're going to try to understand what does it mean to speak of a middle class, right? Support by the state, notwithstanding laissez-faire policies. This was very crucial to the advancement of the Industrial Revolution. The rise of science, a new social structure that brought artisans, workers, and financiers together. New patterns of global trading, such as, for example, Britain's acquisition of India, right? And then obviously the massive trade in textiles, the growth in the trade of textiles, an expanding population that increased the labor supply and the demand for production, slave labor in plantation economies, and capital accumulation for over a century. Right? These are all factors that contributed towards an industrial revolution in Britain and in Western Europe later on. All right, this is the very, very broad picture really that we're speaking about. All right, now let's start looking at a few particular aspects. All right, so some of the readings that I gave you have to do with working conditions in factories. Working conditions in factories. The factory itself was a new institution. It was a new institution. In the year 1600 and 1700, well, you obviously had some degree of manufacturing, but the modern factory really goes back to what you would call the Industrial Revolution. And one of the persons who was fundamentally concerned with the conditions under which the working class worked in these factories was, of course, Karl Marx, who writes extensively on these matters in a large number of his writings, including most fundamentally in Capital. So when these factories were established, it became very clear in a few years after that Parliament would have to do something in order to regulate the working conditions in these factories. The first factory acts were passed in 1802. In 1802. So in Britain now we're speaking about, it took roughly about 4 or 5 decades after the onset of the Industrial Revolution before the first factories were passed. What did these factory acts seek to do? They sought to reduce the length of the working day, which could be as long as 16 to 18 hours. Right? So I hope that all of you have read the testimony, and remember the testimony that you are reading, and you're reading very brief excerpts. This is from 1832, 1833, 1834. Right? And this is around the time that the first really serious pieces of legislation are going to be passed, right? Because there's going to be a committee that's going to be appointed. It's called the Sadler Committee. The committee is called the Committee on the Labor of Children in the Mills and Factories of the United Kingdom, sometimes also known as a Select Committee on Factory Children's Labor. And Michael Sadler, who was the chair of this committee. So this is, by the way, just something that you should be aware of. This is a very common procedure used in countries such as the United Kingdom, and now, of course, for many years, the United States, India. That is, that when the government wants to investigate a particular matter, what does it do? It appoints something called a committee of inquiry, right? The committee of inquiry then produces a report. So the committee of inquiry is a formal institution